Good morning, everyone. I'm not going to extemporize very much because I have things to say. I do want to thank Alan and Sander for the invitation to come here, and I do want to acknowledge the particular place. I'm going to talk about the Minnesota Center in its early days, but in later days, the importance of the Minnesota Center for the creation of HOPOS, the discipline of the history of philosophy of science, thanks largely in the early 90s to Ron Geary, who was then the director of the center, and who in 1993 at the Origins of Logical Empiricism conference gave us entry into his wine cellar. I have vague memories of that night. But I want to talk about Herbert Feigl, the first director of the center and member of the Vienna Circle, logical empiricist, with the radical title, Herbert Feigl, greatest logical empiricist. He certainly is the greatest wearer of a bathrobe in logical empiricism anyway. I'm hoping that this is a bit of a controversial title, after all, but there is a circulating discourse of philosophical greatness that involves things like genius, or having a surfeit of power, intellectual power, one presumes. Among those powers might be reanimation, in the case of the metaphysical animals who are reanimating philosophy itself. Or if you don't like the genius terminology, there is other discourse of philosophical greatness, including giants, the giants upon whose shoulders we stand, perhaps. Which rather figures us as Newton, but that's okay. Or magicians even, right? Magicians. Wittgenstein is the only person who's a giant, a magician, and a genius, but what do we expect? So that is a circulating discourse of greatness, and if that's what you have in mind, then there seems like there are other options among the logical empiricists, our friends Rudolf Carnap, Hans Reichenbach, Moritz Schlick, Carl Gustav Hempel come to mind, and that's in philosophy of science, and that's even before we get to the most interesting man in Vienna, Otto Neurath. The higher the seat, the lower the salary. So there is a circulating discourse of greatness, and you might not naturally think of Herbert Feigl within that discourse. So you might think, and one objection to my title is that it's false. Another objection, since we're talking about logical empiricism, is that it's meaningless. After all, but it's meaningless in a very typical, philosophically bad way. It's harmfully meaningless in the way that the Vienna Circle diagnosed metaphysics. It's not just meaningless, it's harmful. Sorry if this is too small. There are, after all, no uncontested standards for greatness in philosophy. That's why those books that I showed you just a minute ago included Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Elizabeth Anscombe, Frank Ramsey, right? It's not clear that there's any person in the world who thinks all four of those people are great. So we clearly don't, and even if there is, there's a lot of us who don't. So we have no real standards for greatness in philosophy. Indeed, you might think that being worried about which philosophers are great impedes both historical understanding of the development of philosophy. After all, you don't sort of stand out. You're not literally a giant, right? It's not clear in this room how to tell the great people from the non-great people. And it also impedes philosophical progress. And indeed, among the people who claimed that were many of the logical empiricists themselves, who were people like Hans Reichenbach are sort of insistent that part of the problem with philosophy is that it's been organized around great figures that leads to a sort of, as he says, epigonism of sort of a cult of personality in which you're trying to prop up your favorite philosopher and say, these are the great ones, right? Well, that's why, this is a German language context. So you think about neo-Kantians, neo-Hegelians, etc., neo-Schopenhauerians, if that's a word. To which I will say, I grant all of this, but that's not the notion of greatness I have in mind. My title has one virtue, however. Compared to the essay that it is an homage to, namely Hilary Putnam's The Greatest Logical Positivist, at least I don't have a category mistake in my title, because the answer to his question, who is the greatest logical positivist, is Quine, and at least Herbert Feigl is a logical empiricist. I call this version of PowerPoint Quine's Tears. All right, so what do I have in mind? Because I'm setting aside genius, gianthood, giganticness, or magicianhood for greatness. So what do I want to say about what's particularly important in the development of certainly American philosophy of science in Herbert Feigl? Well, he did three things, I think, that are absolutely central to the place that logical empiricism came to have by the late 1940s after the Second World War, and continued to have right through the heyday of logical empiricism through at least the 1960s. And indeed, the centrality of logical empiricism in the development of analytic philosophy is as much Feigl's achievement as anyone's, certainly within the logical empiricist camp. So what are these three things? I'll just list them and then I'll talk about them each in a minute. First, he helped move logical empiricism towards some topics that have had lingering prominence in philosophy of science: scientific realism, physicalism, and theories of mind. He was very keen to talk about identity theories and theory of mind. I'm not an expert on Feigl's own philosophy, so if you're going to ask me questions about that, we're going to find who is an expert in this room to answer. Second, he did many kinds of what I'm going to call infrastructural work that helped logical empiricism gain and retain a place in the American philosophical profession. By infrastructure here, I mean principally sort of editorial and pedagogical work. And we're going to hear more about this in the next session. Third, more than any other logical empiricist, he endorsed what has become the default narrative of logical empiricism and its place in analytic philosophy. And it's the second and third points that I'm going to emphasize, but I will begin by talking a bit about Feigl's own views. Again, I'm not an expert, but I am interested. So first, Feigl, like Reichenbach, was resistant to the anti-metaphysics that was in logical positivism. And thus, he was among those who pushed for both the broader name, logical empiricism, and a more robust form of scientific realism than he found in things like Carnap's, what Richard Creeth has called irenic realism. That wasn't good enough for Feigl. Following on from this, and this is something about which I would like to know a lot more than I do, it was for him, for Feigl, a matter of importance to figure out the ontological relations of the mental and the physical. This is a large part of his work after he moves to Minnesota in the 40s. And more than many of the preoccupations of the more prominent logical empiricists, the alternative geniuses that I put in the second slide or third slide, these issues retain considerable prominence 70 years on, and sometimes at least bear some relation to how Feigl himself talked about these issues. But let me move on to the second aspect of his work, because here I think he's extremely important. Feigl co-edited early influential anthologies that were prominently used in the teaching, especially in the training of graduate students in the 1950s. Famously, 1949, the volume Readings in Philosophical Analysis, co-edited with his colleague at Minnesota, Wilfrid Sellars. And then also Readings in Philosophy of Science, edited by his other colleague at Minnesota, May Brodbeck. There are lots of anthologies. One of the founding moments of analytic philosophy in the late 40s after the Second World War is the creation of a lot of anthologies on philosophical analysis. Certainly within North America, I think it cannot be disputed that this Readings in Philosophical Analysis was the most important. It's what you read if you were going to be trained as an analytic philosopher in the 50s in the United States. Wilfrid Sellars is, of course, the greatest American analytic philosopher. We know that. Some people think he's a pragmatist. That's another story entirely. But this wasn't the only thing that Feigl did, of course, right? So in the context of the Center for Philosophy of Science here at Minnesota, he, together with Michael Scriven and/or Grover Maxwell, co-edited the first 3 volumes of Minnesota Studies in the Philosophy of Science from 1956 to 1962. The authors in these volumes include, in addition to the editors, Carnap, Sellars, Strawson, Hempel, Oppenheim, Putnam, Papp, Feyerabend, May Brodbeck, Adolf Grünbaum. There is some interesting outreach to the scientific community, notably the important Minnesota psychologists, Paul Meehl and B.F. Skinner. Some of you might associate Skinner with Harvard, but it's later on, earlier on and later on. And the topics include scientific realism, interfield relations with an emphasis on the relation of psychology to physics, scientific explanations, space and time, and so on. In addition, Feigl and Sellars, as of January 1950, co-edited Philosophical Studies, which on its title page said, a quarterly journal of analytic philosophy. First journal in North America that used that phrase in its title. This, as you can see from the table of contents, this is the entire table of contents of issue 1. This is not a logical empiricist journal. Those are not logical empiricist topics. Those are not logical empiricist writers. It's not even a journal in philosophy of science. And indeed, as you can see, since it's a quarterly journal and that's the full table of contents, there wasn't a whole lot of essays in the first volume, and 3 of them were on ethics, including one by William Frankena, and one by A.C. Ewing. All right, we'll get back to that, because that's not unrelated to the default narrative of logical empiricism as it is formulated in the late 40s and early 50s. Logical empiricism is widely understood as a chapter of analytic philosophy that brings a verificationist semantics and a similarly virulent anti-metaphysics into analytic philosophy, and then, through internal and external criticism, liberalizes itself and becomes less attached to doctrines like verificationism or anti-metaphysics. But it retains its place fully as a chapter of analytic philosophy. Feigl's own work both offers that narrative and performs practical work aimed at establishing it as a social fact of philosophy, that that's how you should think about logical empiricism. And indeed, importantly, this also has a sort of autobiographical element for Feigl, because he comes to regret, according to his own later reflections, especially in this peculiarly named essay called No Pot of Message, that he came to regret the sort of A.J. Ayer role that he had played in the 30s in the US, where he went around and told people that what they were doing was meaningless. He came to think that this was him being an intolerant person, and it didn't aid either him or his movement to have done that. One thing that I think is really interesting, and now we're going to do some philosophy and some metaphilosophy, and we might even go higher up than that. I think there's a sort of common framework in all of Feigl's reflections from when he's a very young man to when he's reflecting back as an older man. Interesting similarities and differences in how he talks about logical empiricism. And I want to talk about two particular passages and make an argument. I want to make a historical argument that the differences in these passages really matter for the formation of analytic philosophy and for the place of logical empiricism within analytic philosophy. I'm going to read these passages because I think they're too small to read and because I like to read. This is what I do when I teach. So the first passage is from the Journal of Philosophy paper by Alfred Blumberg and Herbert Feigl in 1931, just titled Logical Positivism, which is introducing a North American audience to what logical positivism, this new way of philosophical thinking in Vienna, is. And then in 1943, when he's now at Minnesota, he originally went to Iowa, comes to Minnesota. He's now an established scholar in the American context. He writes a paper in a book edited by Dagobert Runes called 20th Century Philosophy, Living Schools of Thought. He writes the essay on logical empiricism. So logical positivism on the left, logical empiricism on the right. And I'm going to read these because it's too small. And then we're going to reflect on it. So here's Blumberg and Feigl in 1931. The new logical positivism retains the fundamental principle of empiricism, but profiting by the brilliant work of Poincaré, this is going to be our connection back to Lydia's talk, from the brilliant work of Poincaré and Einstein in the foundations of physics and Frege and Russell in the foundations of mathematics, feels it has attained in most essentials a unified theory of knowledge in which neither logical nor empirical factors are neglected. From the point of view of logical positivism, the Kantian synthesis concedes too much to rationalism by assuming the existence of synthetic a priori truths. Against Kant, the new movement maintains as a fundamental thesis that there are no synthetic a priori propositions, basing its assertions upon recent developments in factual and formal sciences. It holds that factual empirical propositions, though synthetic, are a posteriori, and that logical and mathematical propositions, though a priori, are analytic. That's a familiar story. And the next one is a familiar story too, but I need us to think about what's different between them. Here's Feigl in 1943, and this is so small, I'm not sure I can read it. The systematic pursuit of the problem of meaning by means of a logical analysis of language distinguishes logical empiricism from earlier and psychologically oriented types of empiricism, positivism, and pragmatism. the imperative need for a logic of language was impressed upon scientists and logicians most poignantly in the last few decades, just as the seminal ideas of some 19th century philosophers originated in a scientific achievement, Darwin's theory of evolution. So 20th century logical empiricism was conceived under the influence primarily of three significant developments in recent mathematics and empirical science. These are the studies in the foundations of mathematics led by Russell, Hilbert, and Brouwer, the revision of some basic concepts of physics, advanced especially by Einstein, Planck, Bohr, and Heisenberg, and the reform of psychology by the behaviorists, Pavlov, Watson, and so on. Though very different in context and subject matter, these three developments focused attention on the necessity for an inquiry into the limits and structure of meaningful discourse. That's analytic philosophy. This is philosophy of science. They're both philosophy of science, but this is, what I want to say is these are very similar stories, but they're also importantly different stories. You can attend to who appears and disappears across these two passages. You can attend to the fact that the principal framework for thinking about what logical positivism was doing in 1931 is within the theory of knowledge in epistemology. And in 1943, logical empiricism is promoted primarily as a semantic project and not a matter in philosophy and in the theory of knowledge. There might be theory of knowledge consequences, but the last phrase there, the beginning and end of this passage, are about meaningful discourse, meaningful discourse. Kant is still someone to have as an interlocutor in 1931. Indeed, logical positivism has something of a Kantian synthetic ambition while rejecting Kant's own answers to how one gives a proper theory of knowledge for the sciences. Kant has disappeared. Interestingly, and this is, if you're looking to give a student, or if you are a student, if you're interested in having a dissertation topic, the appearance of psychology in 1943 here is really interesting, right? He now says that logical empiricism was developed, was conceived with this question of psychology and what the behaviorists did in mind, which I think is historically false, but he's saying it, and it's interesting that they've arrived as on equal footing with physics and mathematics. That's interesting for his own work and for as a historical claim about the development of logical empiricism. I do think that it's very important as we think of the ways in which logical empiricism is brought into a history of analytic philosophy, that this movement to a semantic framing is absolutely crucial. Because after all, in 1931, if you're reading this, you don't know the subsequent history of logical positivism in 1931, because you can't look forward into the future. It looks like it's going to be really hard to figure out what they're talking about. You're going to have to learn a whole bunch of physics and mathematics. Here, in 1943, it doesn't look so hard. I also want to claim, and this is a larger claim, this is the main claim, I think, of my talk, is that the infrastructural work is argumentative. This is the entire table of contents of readings and philosophical analysis, and it is meant to indicate the range of topics that analytic philosophy, that philosophical analysis can deal with. and to create a history of analytic philosophy. Feigl and Russell are in there. All those other people he talks about, like Einstein and Poincaré, are not. Right. They fade into the background. Feigl and Russell continue to be figures within analytic philosophy. Feigl is such an interesting case because we brought him back to life a la Elizabeth Anscombe. Today, he'd be surprised that he was a philosopher. And the scope of analytic philosophy includes things that look much more like metaphysics in section 6 on the mind-body problem, or ethics than one might have expected from the meetings of the Vienna Circle in the 1920s. And of course, philosophical studies was also meant to exemplify this scope. Both of these things narrate and domesticate logical empiricism and any more radical revolutionary ambitions it might have had. I'm almost done. Hilary Putnam agrees with this. I point you to the second passage. He's being asked in the early 1990s to reflect on his career. What are you talking about when you're talking about these ways in which you learned to what was and wasn't philosophy? I think of my encounter with analytic philosophy. I think of when Herbert Feigl and his collaborators, among them Wilfrid Sellars, started putting out anthologies on analytic philosophy. They told us who was in, who was out, what you had to pay attention to, and what you didn't. And then there were these figures like Dewey who had to go in, but nobody really wanted them. My story here is about Feigl, but the lessons are historiographic. I think Hopo's work really needs to have increased attention, and this is happening, to the philosophical import of infrastructural work, both successful and unsuccessful infrastructural work. I like to add failures to my talks whenever I can. C. West Churchman and Russell Ackoff, his student, Churchman had been an editor of philosophy of science, tried to get a center before the Minnesota Center was founded, a center for experimental inference, which is something they were interested in, both at Penn in the late 40s and at Case. This is a second shout out to the Case Institute, now Case Western University, in the early 50s, and failed in both cases. And both of them ended up leaving philosophy and becoming business school professors. That's a story. The failure of Reichenbach and Frank when Rudner was named the new editor of Philosophy of Science to create a new journal called Natural Philosophy. They tried. Reichenbach said to Frank, this journal will never be our journal. We need a new journal. You have an in with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Get us a new journal. And Frank tried, but they couldn't get the funding. The whole history of philosophy of science is a story of not getting funding, as you know. This isn't just chronology and anecdote in Kuhn's phrase. This kind of work sets the institutional contours of the discipline. As historians of philosophy and philosophers, we need to broaden our conception of argument and our understanding of the settings in which arguments happen. The table of contents of the readings in philosophical analysis is an argument about what people in the 1950s need to pay attention to and what they don't. One thing that has been a problem for those of us trying to give a richer account of logical empiricism and its development is that simple historic narratives work better in the classroom. You've got 13 to 15 weeks. You need to have a simple story. And complicated stories are more accurate. They're also harder to teach. I already said that. And I think that means I am done.
Thank you so much. Does it work?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question with a bad format, namely, of all the things that you did not talk about in the past 40 minutes, why did you not talk about the following that happens to be on my mind? Namely, one, given the setup of your talk, one member of the Vienna Circle, Edgar Zilsel, early on, very early on, developed a whole sociological, philosophical critique of genius cults and their epistemic harm to society and science. And he had the very unfortunate and ironic fate of later be himself called a genius for that feat. So there is an irony, given it occurred to me now that you put these books up of like genius, giant, magician. Is there a time for a reevaluation of that thesis from Zilsel and early logical empiricism?
As you can tell, I didn't have a whole lot of extra time for this talk, but you're right. I mean, and not just Zilsel, I think it's a very large part of when they're sort of reflecting on what the lessons of doing philosophy in a logical empiricist way, and what one of the relations it has with scientific work is the sort of sensibility about good collaborative scientific work, which doesn't involve finding the person in the room who's the genius and then genuflecting in the direction. They're all very clear about this. Zilsel, of course, writes a couple of books about the concept of genius. And I do find it interesting and strange how hard it has been for analytic philosophy, despite being very much concerned with its own research culture and being a very, it's got so many people who do it. Still there's a desire to find the 10 figures who really matter, right? I think that is a sort of very strange thing about our field that isn't the right way to do it.
Oh, thank you. I'm super interested in you said something about the taming of logical empiricism, especially 1950s, and in the kind of institutional framework. And of course, it's 1950s, and if you're trying to lead an institution, especially in America, you have to face McCarthy and McCarthyism, and of course, logical empiricism, especially given its development, has always been rightly or wrongly linked to like certain political and social aims. So I would imagine, what do you think about that angle and that impacting the taming of the content itself? That you need to kind of you need to be on the good side of the government and the man. Yeah.
Well, we have George Reich in the audience. He's one of the people who has an answer to that question. I do think that it matters. I do think that the political context really does matter. I also think, however, that there is an institutional professionalizing moment, which isn't entirely separate for these émigré scholars from the political context, which is doing a lot of the work. That is the structure of the actual philosophical community and all of these things that are happening to universities in the 1950s, the large expansion of public education, the need for more graduate education in philosophy, the need for there to be graduate curricula. All of these things are not separate from, but they're not the same thing as worrying that Joe McCarthy is over your shoulder looking at the content of your work. This is a large question. We can talk about it.
Hi, thanks. So this is really great. I'm really interested in this point that you made about infrastructure as argument. So please take this as an invitation to say a little bit more about that. So one way that you could understand what the argument is here is you should read this and not that, like Pace Putnam's point about legitimacy. And so one obvious response to that is like, okay, well, but why did that argument succeed? Clearly, there's other kinds of factors at stake in the environment in which this is happening. I mean, you pointed to this other work that Feigl was doing to promulgate this narrative about logical empiricism compared to logical positivism. But there's clearly other issues, and maybe one of those other factors is that there just isn't a lot of competition. Like, they're publishing these anthologies. This is kind of an early or nascent movement, or it's just kind of coming into flower, so to speak. And so they're really the only game in town. I just want to invite your response to that.
I wish I had more time. Yes, they're not the only game in town, but they're the new game in town. That's true. Since I have Paul Meal's name up here, I'll do part of this through anecdote. Paul Meal was a student of Feigl at Minnesota and then became a psychology professor, important one here at Minnesota. He said, look, Dewey kept saying things like human beings are psychological, social, and biological animals, and you need to attend to that. And we already knew that. We didn't need to hear that. Everybody knew that in psychology. What we needed was someone to help us think about the conditions under which psychological concepts made any sense. And that's what we got from Carnap and Feigl. That's what they were doing. We found resources for what we needed to do in their work and not in these crazy pragmatists who kept repeating things we already knew. So that's an anecdote that is some sort of evidence for some sort of way in which logical empiricism did speak to a need, at least among some scientists, maybe interestingly in psychology in this case. The other thing that I just want to mention in response to this, and again, we can talk about this more, is that we really do need to attend to how successful analytic philosophy was in this context of the massification of public education in getting rid of. It's not just there weren't other things. We got rid of things, right? Not even necessarily through the agency of philosophy, maybe through the agency of deans. We need more deans in this room. In many North American universities, there arose only after the Second World War faculties of education. And Dewey went to the Faculty of Education. That wasn't really an effort by philosophy to expel Dewey so much as, oh, this is a natural place that Dewey's work is going to. But there was also the expelling of Dewey. I'm very interested in these people like C. West Churchman and Russell Ackoff, who are they're trying to do something that looks like a sort of scientific version of pragmatism in their own view. They're trying to bring that centrally into what philosophy of science is, and they end up getting nowhere, and they end up, this is really interesting part of the story, they end up in business schools, and the important new social sciences in the 1950s are in the Wharton School of Business. Management, decision science, operations research, all of that stuff is the core curriculum of the Wharton School before it became an MBA factory.
Thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. I'm wondering a little bit about a sort of asymmetry in how Feigl presents his own role in the Vienna Circle with how you've presented his role in the sort of development of analytic philosophy here. So in his own telling, he's sort of a minor figure in the Vienna Circle. He's a student of Schlick's, he's invited along, but the real, founders here are Schlick and they're Carnap and people in the Vienna Circle, Reichenbach. And so I'm wondering then, given his recounting of that, how it is that he came to be in position to be so influential in the subsequent development of analytic philosophy. And just to sort of as a first guess, is it just simply a first mover advantage that he emigrated quite early, and so he happened to have more connections in the United States? Anyway, I'm wondering what you might think.
I'll just say two brief things, because I know we're out of time. One, I think it's not just that he's the first, but it's also that he is younger and less established, even in Europe, than those guys are. And he's got a lot of work to do. He needs to find his way in the American philosophical community. Carnap comes, and the first thing that happens when Carnap comes to the US is he gets an honorary degree from Harvard, right? That doesn't happen to Feigl. He ends up going to Iowa and thinking, I'm in a cornfield, what am I supposed to do? But I think also it's this, I'm speaking to activities like editing and creating centers and things like that is crucial to our understanding of how philosophy develops. I think part of what makes Feigl able to do that in a way that somebody like Carnap doesn't even think about doing it is precisely his own sense of, I'm ceding to Carnap and Reichenbach the sort of grand philosophical ideas, but I can do this other work. And I need to do this other work because this work otherwise doesn't have venues to be published.